on people's lives. I love to sense the manifestation of the Spirit. When I see a soul bound and all tied down, I love to see them be made free. And all of a sudden make some kind of a break and make some kind of an overture and movement around them to let you know that they are more zealous for the touch of God than they are sensitive about their person. I like to see people be so desperate about it when they feel bound and tied and cold and dried up that they will holler and they'll speak out and they'll talk and they'll move around enough to let you know that something's happening on the inside of their body and their soul that's causing them to be free. But while that's going on, I love to know that it is a manifestation that can't be condemned by the critical public out here. However, they will always make fun of you to cry. There's some people laugh you to scorn, make you feel like a fool if you even cry. And there's some people so try to be so nice and refined that they would feel bad at you if they see you put your hands up. There's some people would never raise their hands in a church house. Never has and never will. They would just never make any kind of a little physical gesture at all to show the people and to give some response to the moving of the Spirit upon them. There's some people live and die in this world at ripe old age and will never dare to lift their hand one time to the God of heaven and give Him a praise. Millions of people are out there in the graveyard that never one time in their life ever lifted a hand toward heaven and give God thanks. They lifted their hand on other occasions and waved at people and lifted their hands in a political rally or something like that, but they're too bashful and backward and see no need of it and no sense of it, and would think they were going off the deep end, was being too emotional if they lifted their hands and give the Lord a praise. But I love to see people put on those acts and gestures. The Catholic Church, the way they justify falling on the floor, kneeling and all that. And I have pictures in my scrapbook of pictures that I've collected through the years. And I have pictures of big, strong, educated cardinals, great politicians and rich men that would come up to the place where they were going to be ordained by the Pope as a cardinal or something. And there they were, stretched out on the floor. I've got a picture of 20 of them laying right flat of their face on the floor in front of the Pope. And right here in St. Louis, I have a picture out of the paper where some 30 or 40 nuns finished their schooling and their monastery work and laid on the floor with their face right on the floor in front of Cardinal Ritter out here, and while they received the blessing of the Cardinal upon them. They fall on the floor in all that dignity and humble themselves and put on those acts of humiliation. But if we fall on the floor, we're holy rollers. But if they fall on the floor, the press will take a picture of it and put a big caption by it and a big article of how they were consecrated to the nuns and to the bishops and so forth in the Catholic Church. But I believe that we ought to be so slaved and humbled and so saturated with God at times that it does us like it does Daniel, like it did him. It took all the strength out of him, and he couldn't as much as lift his head from the ground until an angel touched him and strengthened him and stood him on his feet again. And it was because God was there ready to give him revelation and great prophecies, and he didn't want any of Daniel's spirit left in him. He didn't want any pride or arrogancy. He didn't want anything in there to resist. And so the Lord sent an overwhelming portion of His Spirit and knocked Daniel cold and on the ground and weakened him to where there would be no resistance, and then gave him those revelations. Paul was caught up to God, and his body had been beaten. He didn't just fall on the ground under the power of God, but he was preaching, and a stone hit him from an enemy. And they beat him up and stoned him until there was no life left in his body, scarcely at all. And in that broken, humble condition, didn't know whether he'd get his next breath or not, he was caught up to third heaven and heard words unlawful for a man to utter. Let me tell you something. If you get close to God, you get out of that carnal frame of mind you're in. You get out of that proud, arrogant, stiff, resistant spirit you're in. If you want God to bless your soul with divine power, if you want strength to live a Christian life, if you want a mind to receive revelation, give yourself to God and reserve in the Spirit once in a while. And quit resisting God. And quit being so proud and haughty. And let God get real close to you. And no human can retain their stubborn spirit and their overbearing spirit No person can retain their pride and get anything from God. And if we would just keep on giving ourselves, yielding up, giving over, breaking down, stirring up, if we just keep it up, when once we feel God, just keep driving on, after a while we'd be found a stack of bones on the floor, and no telling what kind of a contortion God would put us in. But I'll tell you, when you got up from there, if you didn't have a big revelation or see a great vision, you'd get up from there with more God in your life than what you have, that's for sure. For the Lord draws near to people that are humble and broken and not haughty and hard and obdurate against God, but are weakened down to where God sees that there's nothing in them that would argue with God or anything that would be embarrassed or blush over the manifestation of the Spirit. When God sees you in that position, you're in a condition then for Him to give you a revelation or a vision, or to saturate your soul real good with divine holy life until you'd feel clean for days after you have an experience like that. So don't anybody resist that. We must always go out for that, and then keep training ourselves and working to yield to that. And after a while we can yield to that possibly without too much contortion, without struggling too hard, without pressing too hard. How many would like to just in a second's time just reach right out and touch God right now? Just in a second's time. Wouldn't that be wonderful to live that close to God and have a humble heart all the time? And just real quick, in a hurry, your mind just snap like that in God, and that quick you'd be in contact with heaven, and everything else matter nothing. But it isn't that way with us, where the veil is so thick, the flesh is so stubborn, and we've got so many reservations and so many objections that sometimes you have to sing 4 or 5 songs and have a couple prayers and then watch yourself to get close enough to God to even touch God during a 2-hour service. And it's because that hardness there and the habit is formed in our life, and we're not as zealous for the Lord. We don't feel our need of Him as bad as we should. But we ought to be reminded that we stand on the brink of leaving God and losing out with God all the time. We just live right on the brink. Did you ever walk along a precipice, and it was hundreds of feet down right there, and there you were walking on the edge of that? How many has walked around the edge of a building way up high? Have you ever been way up there? Have you ever stood on a high rock someplace and looked down into a jagged valley of all kinds of rocks? When I was out to Colorado with Brother Hall, and he took me around those big high mountains there around Grand Junction, and there was a certain rock where all the sightseers, you had to jump over from the main part of the ground over on this rock, and hundreds of feet way down in there, just dark and foggy and dusty looking and so uninviting and so fearful. I stood there and thought of the earth when the Lord poured the vials out in Revelation, and smoke and noise and thunder and the cry and scream of the damned when the vials is poured out. And I thought, oh my God, that looks so uninviting and horrible down in there. And I walked out on the edge of that rock, and I thought, I'll walk out as far as I dare to walk. I want to see just how it feels out here and see if I've got my equilibrium. And I stepped over on that stone away up there, and a thought came to me, what if this thing would give way? It's been standing here hundreds of years, but sometime it's going to decay, sometime it's going to, something's going to shake it. And I thought, of all the times for this big rock to topple off, it might be while I'm standing on it. And a chill went up my spine, and I jumped off that thing, and I said, that's too much for me. I said, I'm just taking my life in my hand going out there. And then flying through the country, over territory, 35,000 feet in the air is how high I've flown. And I suppose tomorrow I'll be flying 35,000 feet just this side of sound. The sound will be right out in front of that plane like that. That's the way sound will be moving, not just air. We already go on through the air at 200 or 300 miles an hour. When you get up to around 650, sound's right there. And if that pilot just pulls those throttles just a little, he'll go right through that sound barrier, and you'll hear a bang down here on the earth. And that plane's going to be flying just like that, just a little over an hour from here to Detroit. At 35,000 feet, looking down on this earth, you can see the curvature of the earth. It curves a foot every 8 miles, and you can see the curvature of the earth from up there. And looking down in that precipice there, and looking with nothing under us but just air, just depending on the motors and the ingenuity of man and the skill of man to hold that plane up in the air. My. And how fearful it is, and how uncertain everything is, how insecure it is. Did you know, though, you can go in God, you can ascend those heights in God with all safety and all security, knowing that all is well? How high did Paul go? Where in the world did the man go? We know that when his body was stoned, he said, I knew a man. Whether he was in the body or out of the body, I cannot tell. He said, at the time that it happened, I couldn't say whether my body was going or whether it was my soul. He said, I couldn't sense the difference, but I knew that I had my senses with me.